Yo, Frasco, what's happening, man? It's Vinny Herman here, freaking out. I'm starting this tour, with my new band to promote the record, enjoying the ride, because I've been enjoying the ride for a while. It's time to enjoy the ride in a different way, you know what I'm saying? But I'm doing this tour, man. I don't think anybody's going to come to the show, because who's heard of the Vince Herman Band, man? Well, we're starting in Winston, North Carolina on the 3rd. Going to Charleston, Greensboro, Atlanta, Nashville, Petaluma, California, Truckee, Arcata, Felton, Denver, Netherlands, Basalt, St. Louis, Columbus, all this stuff. It'd be a good thing to come to this show, man. Help me out, Frasco.
Lots of blow. He's a lead singer of big rock and roll. Lee Roth, it is his last name. He's got a nickname. It's Diamond Dave. 2 pounds of cocaine before he hits the stage. Doing big old rails with Diamond Dave. Banging all the tail with Diamond Dave. Gotta keep hydrated, drink Gatorade. 10-foot Gator rails with Diamond Dave. Wow, wow.
Okay.
All right, and we're back. Andy Frasco's World Saving Podcast. I'm with my co-host, Nick Gerlach. We have a very special guest today. Very special guest. Not a musician, not an actor, not a comedian. Well, maybe. Ethan, are you a comedian or an actor?
Only in my better moments, Andy. Only in my better moments,
Ethan Nadelmann, good to be on the show. Thanks for being here with us, buddy.
Hey, my pleasure. My pleasure.
Why don't you just tell our audience what you're about first so they get it straight from the horse's mouth?
Sure, Andy. I mean, basically, I've spent most of my adult life, like over 3 decades, working to end the war on drugs. And that meant basically everything from legalizing marijuana, initially for medical purposes and now for all adult use. Secondly, it meant rolling back the role of the drug war in mass incarceration. And the third part of it was really making a real commitment to treating drug use and addiction as a health issue, not a criminal issue. And so I started off as a professor at Princeton. And then I got a call out of the blue one day from a famous philanthropist named George Soros. We hit it off, and I started an organization that became the Drug Policy Alliance, basically the leading organization in the world working to end the drug war. And worked mostly in the U.S., but also internationally. And so we played a pivotal role in ballot initiatives around the world, including Colorado. We were responsible for Colorado's medical marijuana legalization in the late 90s. We played a big role in the legalization one in 2012. Had an office in Colorado actually working there. I know you guys are based there. Yeah. But really all around the country doing that stuff, and even outside the country. And then I stopped running the organization about 5 years ago, handed it off after about 23 years. And now I got a podcast called Psychoactive, which is all about drugs.
Let's go.
Yeah.
Have you ever, do you take drugs or do you just study them?
Oh, no, you got to take them, I think. I mean, if you really want to know what you're talking about, it's like imagine trying to be an expert about France and never having been to France. Like that. So my view is, I've had a friendly relationship with marijuana since I was 18, which means many decades there. And I've enjoyed the psychedelics and all that. And I've tried most of the other substances, the cocaine and heroin and a range of psychedelics and things like that. I've never done fentanyl, never smoked crack. There's a few other things, although I'm a little ashamed to admit that because I think I do have a professional obligation to try just about everything if you're going to be talking about it. But my knowledge of this is based not just on personal experience, because personal experiences can vary. It's also based upon, decades of reading about the history and the politics, the economics, the policy, the science, you name it.
So why don't you explain to me why you started the Drug Policy Alliance?
I mean, basically, I got going on this issue, Andy. It was in the 1980s, actually, a long time ago. And initially, I was just, I was doing a law degree and a PhD, and I was interested in this issue, and I started working on it. And just as I'm finishing my dissertation, the drug war goes into hyperspeed in America. And so, most listeners will be too young to remember now, but in the late 1980s, the war on drugs and the whole crack cocaine crisis was the number one issue in American public opinion. I mean, it was like McCarthyism on steroids.
So
and
crazy.
The whole country got whipped up in this fury, and we just started locking up unprecedented numbers of people, all this propaganda and myths coming out of the government, marijuana getting thrown in with the rest of the war on drugs, people being told things about the relative risks and dangers of drugs that were totally contradictory to the science. It was complicating our international relations. In 1989, over 50% of Americans said the drug issue is the number one threat facing America.
What?
And it was a bipartisan disaster. Oh, it was crazy. I mean, back in the days when TV shows and news TV shows and news magazines made a difference, the covers of Newsweek and Time and all the big magazines and all the big television shows, and 48 Hours was one of them. I mean, it was relentless. You could not turn on the TV without seeing imagery of cops busting down doors and all this sort of stuff. Even the major entertainment programs had drug war themes and all through there. And so this, in the late 80s, just kicked into high speed. It persisted into the 90s at a lower profile. And in many respects, the remnants of the drug war remain with us today. It's one of the reasons why America still has the highest per capita rate of incarceration in the world.
Yeah. This might be ignorant to say, but do you think it's based on racism?
Racism plays a huge role. I mean, if you ask the question, is it possible that we would have gone, back in 1970, we had 500,000 people behind bars in America. We were sort of global average. Right. 20 years later, we had over 30 years later, we had over 2 million Americans behind bars, and disproportionately black and brown men. Right. And there's no way that would have happened if we were mostly putting white people behind bars. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that if you look at historically and ask the fundamental question, why are some drugs criminal and other drugs legal? What you realize, the deeper you go, is it has nothing to do with the relative risk of the substances and everything to do with who uses and who is perceived to use these substances. So historically, you go back to 1870s, 80s when all these drugs were legal, and most opiate users were middle-class white women, right? Using it because we didn't have penicillin and Motrin, and people had their periods, people had diarrhea, right? But when it shifts to the Chinese, that's when you get the first prohibition laws. Cocaine,
oh my God.
Legal, sold in tonics. And then when it starts getting identified with black people down in Louisiana or whatever, that's when you get to criminalization. Marijuana, the association with Mexican Americans, Mexican migrants in the Southwest and the West, that's what results in it. Even alcohol prohibition, to some extent, back in the 20s, was about a bigger conflict between the white Americans coming from Northern Europe and Western Europe, and the not so white Americans coming from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. Right. So race has always played a big role. It's not the only thing. We got a Puritan mentality. We like to put our morals into our criminal laws. We get whipped up in this stuff. So, but race has played a big role, and not especially in the U.S., but a lot of other countries as well.
Do you think the way that how crack cocaine is classified differently than powder cocaine is part of that too? Like how it gets much harsher sentences?
Totally. I mean, look, that snorting something is a little less dangerous than smoking it or injecting it. Like when you smoke or inject, it shoots straight to the brain in a few seconds. When you snort, it takes more time. If you take it, you eat it or drink it, it takes even more time. But the truth is, basically, powder cocaine and crack cocaine are fundamentally the same drug.
Right.
And so when Congress made those penalties and said that, the penalty for 5 grams of crack cocaine is going to be the same as for 500 grams of powder cocaine, and then you look around the country and there were some jurisdictions like in LA where there were no white people being, prosecuted for crack. And you look at other places, so it was really, and that to some extent that's changed the federal level and the state level now. It's not really down to 1-to-1, but eventually even some of the drug war types said this is a little crazy. There's no science at all backing up this distinction in how we treat the two drugs.
Okay.
It's pretty wild because like when you were first starting this alliance and like with the Reagans really pushing this war on drugs, how hard was it to like get everything really processed without like getting death? Were you getting like death threats in the beginning? Like, because you're basically fucking with people's money.
It's a little, I mean, I'll tell you, when I first started late 80s and I was teaching at Princeton, and I was worried because just a few years earlier, I had actually had a security clearance and was working in the State Department's Narcotics Bureau and interviewing drug enforcement agents all around the world and writing a book about that called Cops Across Borders and being very fair-minded about it because, those guys had opened their doors and I wanted to be fair-minded. So I had hung out with all the DEA and FBI, CIA, Customs, you name it, just a few years earlier. So I was nervous, but nothing ever happened. Only time I really sometimes I give a speech and, those early days and people, I thought they'd come up and they'd want to punch me in the face. Nobody ever did. The only time I got death threats was when I was on O'Reilly, and I got into a real fight with O'Reilly on the thing. And I think I kicked his butt, I mean, he's so full of shit. And I go back home and I turn on my answering machine and it's like I got 2 calls saying, if I ever come across you, I'm going to fucking bludgeon you. And, so I got some death threats, in that sense, but not of the type that would cause me to call the cops or worry about, looking over my shoulder or stuff like that.
So explain the Fox thing. Like, when you go in there, you're basically getting, shot at it from every angle. Right. What's your angle to like at least get, because they're not going to listen to you, but like how do you approach that conversation with O'Reilly?
I gotta tell you, Fox is interesting. There were a few years ago, was being on all the networks, the main networks, all this sort of stuff, but the 2 that were most frequently inviting me, one was Fox and the other one was Al Jazeera, right? Far left, far right.
Right.
But the interesting thing about Fox was they had a whole libertarian contingent here. And this is one of these issues that although most of my base and my staff were coming from, left of center, I had guys on the right, William Buckley and Milton Friedman, the 2 most famous conservatives in late 20th century America were my allies. George Shultz, the former Republican Secretary of Everything, was on my honorary board. Frank Carlucci, the former Republican Secretary of Defense and, Deputy CIA was on my honorary board. I mean, first governor to step out on my side was Gary Johnson, a Republican governor in New Mexico. So I was always doing bipartisan stuff. I'd walk into Fox and a bunch of the Fox stations, there was a guy, I think a former judge or something, who was on my side. Some others were. All the producers, the guys working the cameras, they were all on my side. Right. So it was mostly, O'Reilly, which I was on about, 3 times or so, and a few of the other knuckleheads there, doing the old reactionary right thing. And in those cases, I would just slam into them with the evidence, And the fact of the matter is, even with O'Reilly, he'd actually written a master's thesis at the Kennedy School at Harvard. He doesn't want to talk about it, about drugs. And it was actually not a dumb thesis. So he knew better. And I remember, after we kind of had a big fight on his TV and we go off air and I look at him and he goes, we're actually not that far apart. So, I mean, part of this was an act, I mean, it was kind of pathetic.
It's good to know we're only 1 degree of separation from Bill O'Reilly right now.
Oh man. My character, he was, but Fox, but it was good for Fox because, I don't know if Fox would still do that anymore. I mean, I'm not so much on TV anymore since I stopped running my organization 5 years ago. I don't know if Fox has that diversity of opinion even on the drug issue now. Maybe, not sure.
What's your take on big pharma and the opioid addiction?
Well, 2 things. I mean, first of all, seeing Purdue and the Johnson & Johnson, all the others, I mean, seeing them get slammed against the wall and sued for tens of billions of dollars by state and local governments and everybody and the drug distributors as well, they deserve it. Because, especially Purdue Pharma, when they created that OxyContin, which was a particular formulation of oxycodone is the generic name, OxyContin it was a miracle drug for many people who had serious pain.
Right.
But then those fuckers promoted it, for chronic pain, for people and this other sort of stuff, totally irresponsibly, right? And so they really played a role in the late 90s and early 2000s in really sort of escalating the whole opioid epidemic. That said, if you look at it, that started to get pulled back on already 10, 15 years ago. And 10, 15 years ago, there were maybe a few tens of thousands of people dying, from an overdose, a lot of it involving pharmaceuticals. Last year, we had 100,000 people die of an overdose, mostly involving fentanyl or other, illicit opiates, not from the pharmaceutical companies, right? And I mean, that's as many people as all the car accidents and all the firearms, right? Both homicides and suicides, plus, drownings and you name it put together. That's how many people died of an overdose last year. And that's not about big pharma. That's about an unregulated drug supply. Fentanyl is a pharmaceutical that's used in the hospital, but the fentanyl that people are dying from, and fentanyl is like 100 times more potent per gram than heroin. That's all stuff that's coming illegally into the country, initially from China and now from Mexico. And it's so tiny. I mean, if there 10 times, 100 times as much fentanyl comes to this country, I mean, the whole idea of stopping at the border is just absolutely ludicrous because you can put it, the amount that goes into a suitcase could supply, half the country for a number of days, right? I'd say that.
It's so much. It's so concentrated. Yeah.
So keep going with this opioid because we have.
Yeah. So what I'm going to say is that the pharmaceutical companies, they start to pull back. They get a little more responsible. Then heroin replaces around like 2005, 6, 7, 8, and there's huge amounts of heroin coming from Mexico. No way to stop that at the border either. Every penny you spend on trying to stop drugs at the border or in the source country is money down the drain. If you're going to spend money trying to do a drug abuse problem, it should be trying to help people who are struggling and having a problem, not about all this locking people up, spending huge amounts of money, all this type of stuff. But now, paradoxically, you want to know something?
Yeah.
If you gave me a choice between a leaky pharmaceutical system like we had back 20, 25 years ago when, or the current system where big pharma is much tighter about what they're putting out there.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, we got fentanyl just flowing into the country. I would say that the leaky pharmaceutical system that we had 20 years ago was less of a problem than the problem we have today. And in some respects, cracking down on big pharma, paradoxically, opened up the wave of first heroin and now fentanyl. So it's a complicated situation. Yes, slam the pharmaceutical companies for what they did back then. But to think it's a single variable that they caused this whole thing is a gross mistake. And there's a lot of other stuff going on. It's all about, people in America wanting to pop a pill to take away every pain. It's all about doctors and nurses not being trained in pain management and not having enough time to deal with their patients who want to do that. It's about insurance companies who'd rather pay for a pill than pay for physical therapy that could work a lot better in dealing with people's pain. So it's a very complicated issue. And right now, the key priority has to be getting a handle on this basically unregulated illicit supply of fentanyl. And the only way to do that is to step up pretty close to, allowing people who are using opioids illegally and are committed to using them illegally to get them from a legal source. Right. I'm not saying sell it over the counter like booze or cigarettes or now weed is, but I'm saying figure out the way where people are using these drugs and they're going to go to the black market and get it there. You don't want them going to the black market. Let them get it from a legal supply. And already you see folks up in British Columbia, Vancouver, experimenting with this. I mean, we got to move into a more radical direction if we're going to get a handle on this overdose crisis.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. And before we talk about what other policies other countries have, I want to talk a bit about the reason why we have fentanyl now is because our tolerance for opioids has gone stronger? Or why fentanyl?
It initially appeared to happen because drug dealers, and probably not at the street level, but probably higher up the chain, realized that if you cut the heroin with fentanyl, it saved them money. In other words, they could put a product out on the street, and by cutting heroin with the fentanyl, it just saved them a lot of money because the heroin was more expensive per gram. What some point was starting to happen was that, 6, 7 years ago, when somebody who was a heroin user got some fentanyl, they go like, what's this? But now actually the consumer tastes have changed. Right. And so now people, fentanyl is really what's out there not all around America, but a growing part of America, it's fentanyl. And if they get heroin, people go, what's this? Right. And then it is also true, as you were saying, Andy, there are also people's tolerance. For some people now, heroin doesn't even do it because fentanyl is a lot more potent. Right. The thing we really don't understand is why you can understand why people looking for opioids, things to kind of bring you down, calm you down, shut out the world. You can understand why they would go from heroin or pharmaceutical opioids to fentanyl. What we don't understand is why is like cocaine and methamphetamine
exactly
being cut, right?
It feels like a speedball.
Yeah.
It's a speedball.
Exactly.
Also,
so
you're risking killing your...
Say that again.
I mean, basically, it's true because one question is maybe it's that people are looking for the good old speedball. Speedball was, heroin and cocaine combined back in the day. And sometimes I joke around, my speedball, would be like, an espresso and a glass of wine, right? It brings you up and down. It gives you some energy, but calms you down. Yeah. So it's not clear. But then you have people who, most people who are dying of overdoses are people who are pretty into drugs. But then you get, a not insignificant percentage who are people just wanting to snort a few lines of cocaine or whatever. And next thing they know, they're dead of an overdose because they didn't know or expect that the fentanyl would be in there. In fact, it's probably the case that for many of the retail dealers, the ones that, somebody uses cocaine or other drugs we get their drugs from, it's good reason to believe that many of them don't even know that what they're selling has fentanyl in it. That it's being cut with the fentanyl higher up the chain. Wow. And that's why these laws, that basically say we're going to, throw the book at anybody who sells fentanyl. I mean, to throw the book at somebody who sells fentanyl, who didn't even know fentanyl was in that, what's the deterrent power of that? You guys are sitting in Colorado, and I really admire your governor, Jared Polis.
Yeah,
he's been very good on the marijuana issue, a range of other issues. I mean, he's a smart, good guy. I know him a little bit, but he felt compelled to sign some stupid ass law that was, increasing penalties on fentanyl in a way which is going to spend millions of dollars putting people in prison for long periods of time and do absolutely nothing to reduce the problem of overdose in the state or the country.
Right.
Yeah, and going to that point, first off, before we go to that point. What happened to Quaaludes? I've always wanted to try a Quaalude.
Don't they not make them anymore, right?
It's a fascinating question because I came of age. I was a teenager in the 70s. And I remember I hear about Quaaludes from the kids in high school who were like 2 years older than me. And like I graduated high school in 75, but in my cohort in 75, like nobody knew about Quaaludes. I mean, it was like the kids who graduated high school in 72, 73. So it looked like the pharmaceutical companies stopped making it. And typically you then start to see it being illegally made, but it didn't seem to happen. When I was in college, I did it a couple of times.
Hell yeah.
And it was great. I mean, I gotta say, and you got to be careful. You got to be careful because, like, with alcohol, if you combine drugs like opioids with alcohol, you combine benzodiazepines like Valium, sleeping pill type drugs with alcohol, or Quaaludes with alcohol. The thing about combining with alcohol is if you do it in the right amount, like a modest amount, it can be a great high. Right. But if you like just double that amount, you can stop breathing. So I will admit in college, there was one evening where, I had some drinks, it had Quaalude, and I had just a wonderful time. I mean, people would describe Quaaludes as like, feeling all uninhibited like you were drunk, but without feeling all cloudy like you were drunk.
Right.
But it did have a real risk. I mean, I think there were real risks associated with Quaalude. It's probably a better thing than not that they're not out there in a big way today.
Is it an opioid?
But I don't know for sure.
Is it an opioid?
No, I'm actually... I think it's not an opioid. It's not an opioid. I know that. And it's not exactly like the Ambien drugs. It's some other type of, it's another type of drug that I think brings you down and calms you out. Yeah. The other one that disappeared, which was probably a good thing, was barbiturates. Barbiturates was a big thing back in the 60s and such, 50s, 60s. And those ones disappeared. And that was probably a good thing because barbiturates had a pretty high risk potential. And easier to overdose, get in trouble with. And so when they disappeared and were not replaced by the black market in a big way, that was probably a good thing from a public health perspective.
Do you think opiates will disappear?
Never. I mean, look, you look at the fundamental drugs, opium, which results in heroin and all the other ones, coca, which becomes cocaine, cannabis, tobacco, which becomes nicotine, and booze. Those five have a global history going back thousands and thousands of years. There's a reason why those drugs have hung around for so long. I mean, they dig up, people, archaeological sites from thousands of years ago, and they find them with some opium, or they find them with some cannabis or something like that. I mean, tobacco was only in the Western Hemisphere until people from Europe came and brought it back to Europe and spread it around the world.
Right. Yeah.
Alcohol, people have been figuring out about alcohol. I just had an interesting guy on I should mention my podcast called Psychoactive, all about drugs.
Yeah.
I had this guy, Edward Slingerland, wrote a book called Drunk, in which he asked the question, why, given that alcohol, is so destructive for so many people, why has it persisted all around the world? And he said, basically, because the benefits, not just of alcohol, but of drinking and even getting drunk, exceed the harms that alcohol do in most societies. Right. That it's been played a pivotal role in human civilization. And that alcohol emerged even before human beings started, settling down and having agriculture, right? I mean, even hunter-gatherer types were gathering to use alcohol together. So I think with coming back to opium and the opioids, it's possible that the synthetics may one day replace, synthetic nicotine may one day replace tobacco-derived nicotine. Synthetic opioids may one day replace if the cost works out that way. But I think these things are here to stay. I mean, remember, opium and the opioids are the great pain reliever even today.
Right. Isn't that the problem with America, though? Is like we're more worried about making money off our people than helping them?
Generally speaking, I would say, America spends a fair bit amount on trying to help people, but we spend even more money trying to fuck them up. Or allowing other people to do it, right? I mean, you look, one of the reasons I started my organization back in the 90s was to educate Americans about the ways that other countries, especially in Western Europe, were dealing with this thing. And, one way, if I go to the Netherlands or go to other European countries and I say, how come your drug problem is so small compared to ours? They say, well, part of it's we got a smarter drug policy than yours. But the other thing is we got a better social safety net. We got national health insurance. We got housing program. We got stuff so that people who are struggling with addiction or living rough on the streets, we can help people. And we don't get all ideological about it. In America, forever and ever, if you had a drug problem, we're gonna shove you into an abstinence-only program. And if you can't cut it, we're going to throw you in prison. Right. But, the Europeans pioneered the harm reduction approach, which is to say, we'd like you to get off drugs. We'd like you to be drug-free. But if you can't do that today, let's make sure you stay alive and healthy till the day when maybe you can get off. And that harm reduction approach helps explain why, they didn't lose hundreds of thousands of people to AIDS the way America did. It explains why they don't have the huge overdose problem we have. It explains why they don't have the same problems with drug-related crime that we have. So it's just about being pragmatic. And we tend oftentimes to let other things like ideology get in our way of pragmatism.
One thing also I like about the Netherlands is they have a national service where you could bring in your drugs and they'll tell you exactly what's in them.
It's true. It's called drug checking. I mean, the Dutch pioneered that. They used to actually have people in the local health department who would go to clubs and, the drugs were still illegal, but somebody who bought a drug at the club or came in with it could take it over to the counter, give the person from the public health department, and they would test it and say, well, here's what you got. So in the U.S., there's a wonderful organization called DanceSafe. In fact, I think the guy's based where you guys are in Denver. Yeah. And they're doing that. They're going to clubs. They're going to, music festivals, other things, and they're doing that stuff. And I think, I'm not sure, but I think some cities and governments are beginning to subsidize that stuff now because everybody's freaked out about fentanyl, right? And because fentanyl, with heroin, most people don't die from taking too much heroin. Typically, you had to combine the heroin with alcohol or benzos. So most drug overdoses before fentanyl were really, it was a wrong name. They were really fatal drug combinations. Okay. But with fentanyl, you don't need to combine it with anything. It's just a little too much fentanyl all by itself kills you. So the need for drug checking, which exists in growing parts of Europe, Australia, Canada, and really beginning to spread around the U.S., but much too slowly. I'm always amazed when you get cops and politicians who oppose drug checking services. Right. It's like they're saying we'd rather have somebody die if you use the drug we don't like. And it's just,
What about, so we talked about fentanyl. Do you think people are putting fentanyl in their drugs in the, in the underbelly of America? Is that malicious, or do you think they're doing it because
Just for the money.
For the
I'll
money.
tell you, one thing I'm very frustrated by is that, the United States federal government has an agency called NIDA, National Institute on Drug Abuse, right? It's the Drug Research Funding Agency. And it basically funds like over 80% or more of all the drug research on illicit drugs in the world, not just in the U.S. But they're always saying, we're not interested in looking at the safe uses of drugs. Like they would never see what were the medical value of marijuana. It was all about trying to prove that marijuana could be harmful. And the same thing, I look at with kratom now, one of the drugs is out and about, right?
Isn't that like heroin?
They can't. No. I mean,
Synthetic?
people use it to get off heroin. But it's not like heroin. I mean, God, you can buy it in stores in most states around the country.
Yeah,
right?
I see it there's kratom
you got to
shops.
be careful.
Yeah.
I don't know if you say kratom or kratom or what the word is. It depends where you live. But there's kratom shops. Sometimes right around the corner from me in New York is a CBD and kratom shop, right?
Oh wow.
But I'm gonna say is that when you're asking about what are the dealers doing, we don't really know. And my view is that the U.S. federal government, instead of spending all this money, which is going down the drain, trying to show that these drugs are dangerous, so like that, they should be hiring, ethnographers, graduate students to go in and begin to interview people who are involved, both behind bars and those out on the streets, to find out where are these drugs getting cut? Why is fentanyl being put in there? Why is fentanyl getting mixed in with a cocaine or methamphetamine supply? A few months ago, there were a couple people who died because somebody had put fentanyl into ecstasy, MDMA, Molly.
Right.
I mean, so that's really dangerous stuff. And we don't, I don't think it's malevolence. I think it's a combination of trying to make more money because fentanyl is cheap and it goes a long ways. I think part of it is ignorance, where sometimes, you may have people who are mixing drugs and you have somebody in a little mini lab or even just like a little, apartment trying to sell drugs. And if a little bit of fentanyl gets in the cocaine, that's a real problem. It may be because some people are now looking for that fentanyl, stimulant combo, the good old modern day speedball, but we really don't know the answer.
It's pretty wild to me. And, going into... Okay, so I want to talk about psychedelics too in a second, but before we talk about that, I want to talk about do you blame the privatization of jails for us putting our funding into that when someone gets in trouble with drugs versus why don't we just build a lot of rehab centers and therapy centers to get people healed through their brain?
Yeah, well, I would say, the private prison industry, what a malevolent force. People who make their money off of locking people up. Now, one could say, well, if private prisons were actually providing a better service than public prisons, in other words, if they were actually keeping inmates safer, doing it at lower cost to taxpayers, having lower rates of recidivism, then maybe you can make an argument that private prisons make sense. But it turns out private prisons aren't even doing that. They're not more cost effective, it turns out. They don't produce a better quality prison. They don't have lower levels of violence, what have you. So they have been a really malevolent force, especially in the South, where they've been pretty prominent. Right. But I'll tell you this, when I and my colleagues were putting together ballot initiatives in California, give me a second here. When we were putting together ballot initiatives to, reduce the penalties on drug offenses, our biggest problem in states like California, it wasn't the private prison industry, or in New York for that matter. It was the prison guards unions, right? Because they were the guys saying, they were working for the state, but they were basically worried that if drug policy reform got too far, it would cut the state prison populations by hundreds of thousands. And then what do? There'd be fewer jobs available and less, especially less overtime available. So for me, now the prison guards unions are not quite as bad as they used to be. But for me, given that the states we were working in, we were very intensely focused on California, New York, Colorado, New Jersey, New Mexico, and then we were helping out in about a dozen other states, and we were only a little bit in the South. So some parts, private prison, it's just a venal industry, altogether. Yeah. But the prison guards unions, the correction officers unions, they were a major, major problem as well. Not as bad as the prosecutors associations. Yeah. No,
I never thought about that, actually.
I know, and many of them were allied with the Democrats, and so it was kind of weird, because they would be taking sort of progressive positions on some things, but then they'd be saying, well, hey, don't reduce the penalties too much.
Exactly.
We need a job. Paid. Yeah.
And unions technically. Yeah.
What about
exactly?
What about with Biden passing that where everyone could leave?
Pardon, the federal pardon.
Federal pardon for weed. Is that just a Band-Aid over a bigger problem?
Well, I mean, let's just say, first of all, I mean, Joe Biden, I mean, look, on the one hand, I mean, this guy is for decades a lifelong drug warrior. I mean, I admire, I'm a Democrat. I admire a lot. I think Biden has done some really big stuff. I admire the way he's gotten these major bills through Congress with Schumer and the others. I think he's doing a great job in trying to pull the world together about Ukraine. I think he's taking serious the climate change stuff. I think he's thinking for the future. So I think Biden's doing a lot of good stuff for the country. And I think he's getting a lot of bad rap because people don't actually pay attention to the stuff that's going on. But when it comes to the drug stuff, Biden's an old-fashioned drug warrior. I mean, among all the Democrats, he was one of the worst. Back in the 80s, 90s, the whole idea of treating a rave as the same as a crack house, that was Biden pushing that bill forward.
Yeah, he had the Rave Act, right?
Rave Act, exactly. I mean, my organization led the opposition to that, but he beat us. And, so Biden was bad. And then back in the Democratic primaries in 2019-20, he was the worst of all the Democrats on the drug issue, right? And so, I mean, he'd come around a bit. He was against all these mandatory minimums and that crack cocaine, powder cocaine disparity. He tried to carve out some issues on that, but he was the most anti-marijuana one. He was the most, but look, here's what I'll say now. When it comes to embracing harm reduction, the basic approach of, not just setting up abstinence clinics, but having overdose prevention programs and having the naloxone out there, which is the antidote for an overdose, and making needle exchange programs available. I mean, his administration, Obama had started doing some of it without talking about it. Trump, fortunately, did not shut it all down. And then Biden's administration has now embraced it. So that's a good thing, right? Mm-hmm. On the marijuana thing, he's been slow, he's been problematic. Then finally, in early October, he announces, hey, okay, we're going to pardons for all the federal marijuana offenders. But the truth is, Andy, there's only like 6,000 people have ever. I mean, you basically got to get arrested in a national park.
Right. So it's only federal.
It's only federal. Now, the second thing he said was, I'm going to encourage the other states to do the same thing. Many of them are already doing it. And it's not as if them doing it makes a big difference. The third thing, though, is he said he's going to look at the federal government's broader policy on marijuana. And so that whole question of whether or not marijuana, it's in Schedule 1, the same as heroin, the same as LSD. I mean, it's a crazy system we set up back in 1970 of scheduling drugs. It makes no sense anymore. It should be eliminated. So I think that it's symbolically speaking, what Biden did was very important. It was sending a message saying, okay, I hear you. I get it. He probably had to have his arm twisted by his staff. Yeah. There's a poll that just came out showing, he's getting some kudos for the whole thing. But he's been back when he was vice president, I was at some gathering of wealthy Democratic contributors, and I lined up a whole bunch of people, and he was going down the receiving line, and one after another of us grabbed his hand and lectured him about marijuana. And so he got slammed. And 6 months later, I'm meeting with one of his deputy chief of staff, and he's going, "Yeah, Biden got killed at this Democratic gathering." I go, "Oh yeah, man, I arranged that stuff." Biden's had his face, but he's. It's a complicated issue because also Biden's had a tight relationship with the older Black community for a long time. Right. I mean, a lot of times he took his guidance from older Black politicians and others in Delaware. And, you look at, that population, now as people age, you're getting more comfortable with marijuana legalization and all this sort of stuff. But he comes from an old world like that. Also interesting, you think about it. 3 of the last 5 presidents, or 4, what is it? I mean, George Bush, right, and Trump and Biden are all teetotalers. They don't drink.
Oh yeah,
right. Wow. I mean, I think the only drinker we've had since the beginning of the century in the White House was Obama.
I read this study that the young kids aren't drinking and doing as many drugs anymore.
No, or having sex.
Yes, because it's been. You know why? I mean, it's because of everybody's on their phones and stuff.
Yeah.
All that,
That's
and
what
basically,
that's a new drug.
getting drunk and getting high does not increase your appreciation of video games or Facebook or TikTok or stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
And you're spending more and more time doing that. You're spending less time hanging out, sharing a joint. You're getting a little drunk with your friends and all this sort of stuff. And so it's a very mixed thing. It may mean fewer people dying in accidents, stuff like that. On the other hand, a lot more people feeling isolated, a lot more young people losing social skills. So,
socializing. And, that's one thing about drugs was it was social. Nowadays, like this idea of social, that's why I think social media is a bigger problem for mental health than drugs are, because you're isolating yourself by just absorbing yourself into everyone else's fake happiness.
I mean, it's so true. I mean, you look at it, there's actually good social science evidence on this stuff that younger people, I mean, the pandemic, of course, made it a lot worse. But I mean, younger people are not as good, for example, at reading sort of facial cues and social cues. And the levels of depression and things like that among young people is higher now. A lot of people think that's once again because of social media and the whole atmosphere and what's the expectations around that. And so, I mean, look, when I was younger, I mean, I didn't smoke joint until I didn't get high till I was 18, but I remember getting drunk even in my younger teens. And, I mean, some of that landed up, for some people in very terrible places. But for a lot of people, it's part of, growing up. It's part of bonding. And I think some of my best male friends for the last 40 years are guys I first bonded with when we were getting drunk together.
Same.
So,
still doing it.
I mean, it's, yeah. Hey, listen, I exactly, there you go. I got to say one other thing too, there's another drug out there where I see that the whole issue now that came out right before the pandemic, the epidemic before the pandemic, I don't know if you remember, it was all about vaping, right?
Yeah.
People juuling, using e-cigarettes, right? And I even found that, and all like a lot of my political allies, the ones who were with me on legalizing marijuana, on the needle exchange, harm reduction, rolling back prison sentences, but they're all jumping on the bandwagon. We got to ban nicotine vaping. We got to and it was using the same rhetoric, just like the drug war ultimately was like marketed as one great big child protection act. Suddenly the anti-vaping thing, one great big child protection act. But you want to know the truth of this thing?
What?
If you could snap your fingers and all of the 35 million American smokers or the billion plus smokers around the world were suddenly to switch to vaping, e-cigarettes or using those heated tobacco products or using the little pouches you put in your mouth, the snus or the Zyn or On or stuff like that, it would be one of the greatest advances in public health in American and global history. Because the fact of the matter is, nicotine is what hooks people. But it doesn't kill you. You can take nicotine for your entire life, and it has very little harm that it causes to the human body. I mean, there's some evidence that says it's barely more dangerous than coughing. What kills you is smoking it. It's the burnt particle matter. It's lighting it up. And so anytime you can get somebody who's been smoking to switch to a non-combustible version of nicotine, it's a dramatic improvement in public health. It's not 100% safe, but it's like 80 to 90% safer than smoking cigarettes. And the fact of the matter is, for young people getting into it, we all wish they wouldn't do it. Please don't do it. I'm not saying young people should vape, but the truth of the matter is that the cumulative harms, to people getting into vaping is so dramatically less than cigarettes. And one reason cigarette smoking has come down so much among young people is because vaping became more popular. So, a lot of people think they know what they're talking about on this stuff, but I got to tell you, the science and the evidence suggests that if we could go from a world in which 1 billion people are smoking cigarettes and 100 million are using the non-combustible, vapes and lozenges, and we could go into a world where that billion smokers is now down to a couple 100 million, but the number of people consuming nicotine in other non-combustible forms is up to 1.5 billion or 2 billion, like double the number of smokers, it would still be a radical advance in public health and around the world. So I hope your listeners know that. Anybody you know who smokes or loves somebody who smokes, whatever you can do to say, if you can't quit, do the e-cigarette, do the lozenge, do the Zyn or the
I'll start
On
smoking
the,
e-cigs. You told me, doctor.
Well, don't start if you're not already using nicotine. But
I'm smoking a shit ton. What about I have a couple more questions for you. Do you have time for a couple more?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay. Is cocaine bad for you?
Well, I mean, the truth is, I'm down on cocaine. I mean, I think cocaine does not bring out the best in people.
Oh yeah, I know.
People tend to motor pals and get selfish and all this sort of
Yeah.
stuff. I, for better or worse, have never had a real. I mean, I've tried. I tried cocaine dozens of times when I was younger, and for me, it was like having too much coffee and having postnasal drip. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, I just didn't get it.
And wanting
But I
to
had
beat
other
off all
friends
the
who was
time.
like, actually, that's interesting because the other thing with cocaine and sex, right, is if you, I mean, whatever.
Yeah, it's a free
With
space.
cocaine and sex, it's that if you using it right before sex can definitely be an enhancer. On the other hand, I found using it a few hours before sex, it's hard to get an erection.
Oh yeah,
So
yeah.
Timing counts
Tug
a
and
lot.
rope over
Now,
here.
As with any drug, it's all about the amount you use it, right? I mean, somebody who's doing the occasional few lines of cocaine or something like that, or, I mean, that's not going to hurt anybody. And quite frankly, all the indigenous people in Bolivia and Colombia, Peru, who are chewing that coca leaf, which is basically a slow drip of cocaine into your body all day long.
Yeah.
I mean, the evidence suggests that maybe a net benefit for their health, right?
Yeah.
And conversely, weed, for most people, weed's a net plus in their life. But I know people for whom weed has been the worst possible drug, who get delusional, who get addicted, dysfunctional. So, any drug can be safe. You can smoke crack on occasion as long as you're not getting into it.
Let's go.
And it's not really going to do much harm to you. I'm not recommending
Everything in moderation.
It's everything in moderation, including moderation.
Exactly.
Yeah. Hell yeah. I'll clap to that. Let's go. All right, my last thing is, I don't know if you could tell by how we look. We love psychedelics. I love acid.
Me too.
I love mushrooms. I take mushroom. When I was severely depressed for a couple years ago, I would do a microdose every day, and it really helped my depression. How far are we from the public eye thinking that psychedelics are actually better for you than people think they are?
Well, more and more people know that. I mean, the thing that's been coming out is, back in the 50s and 60s, there was a lot of research, including paid for by the government, about psychedelics as a therapeutic substance. Mm-hmm. And then basically Nixon's drug war, and, basically you can blame Timothy Leary, even more you can blame the targeting of Timothy Leary. All that stuff kind of gets wiped out, and almost nobody's doing any research on psychedelics for decades. Now, in the last 10 years, mostly funded with private money and some philanthropic money, there's a great organization called MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, that's been leading the research effort on MDMA, which is not really a psychedelic, ecstasy. But I'd say you now have amazing research coming out. You have hard scientists who are blown away by the results in terms of the efficacy of MDMA, but also psilocybin, which is the drug in mushrooms.
Yep.
In terms of, it appears to be the case probably with LSD. There's also ibogaine. There's mescaline, which comes from peyote and the San Pedro plant. Right. There's some synthetics which may prove interesting. And what they're finding is in dealing with depression, anxiety, end of life care, possibly pain, addiction, also ketamine. I forgot to mention ketamine because that's the one legal psychedelic, and it's short acting, so easy to administer and use. Yeah. So I think, people can get caught up in all the hype of this thing, and there's definitely some people overhyping the thing, but it's going to revolutionize psychiatry. I think almost no question
100%.
About it. It is going to help a huge number of people. One thing I'll put in a plug for my podcast, Psychoactive. A lot of the episodes are talking with experts about psychedelics, from ketamine to microdosing to LSD to mushrooms to ibogaine, you name it. It's amazing. And then you look at this point, Harvard, Yale, Johns Hopkins, NYU, University of California, Baylor, I think University of Florida, also I think Texas, University College London, all have major research programs on psychedelics. This would have been unimaginable just 10 years ago.
It's crazy.
And there's being more and more stuff published in the scientific literature. I just think it's amazing and fantastic. For me, I've tried many of them, but not all. I've never done ibogaine. Mushrooms has been kind of my go-to since, I just think mushrooms is great. And,
let's fucking go.
And ayahuasca I've done a few times. Those are powerful experiences. But it's obviously important. I don't recommend that people. I also am a believer that psychedelics are oftentimes wasted on the young. I mean, my view is that we should keep doing psychedelics.
Save
as
it.
we get older.
Save it.
We love to hear it, bud.
I
Wasted on
gotta
the
tell you,
young.
one time I gave a speech about 10 years, and I said, you know something, I'm Jewish. Once a year, on Yom Kippur, I fast. No food or water for like 25, 26 hours.
Right.
Just did it recently, right? And I feel like it's good for the soul. It's good to kind of get into that altered state and be in the, and that's the way I feel about psychedelics, that people should make a commitment to trying to have a strong, not a microdose, but a strong experience once a year till they grow old. Because it's a great way to stir up the old intellectual and emotional sediment that as we get older, we make compromises, we settle, we start to think in a straight lines, and psychedelics shakes that stuff up, both intellectually and emotionally. And, all the better if you can find a guide to do it with or somebody who's experienced, but find a safe way to do it. Don't do it doing it and going to a concert or walking around a city. Not generally a great idea. It could turn out to be a great time, but it's got more risk associated with it. Do it in a safe place with people you feel really comfortable, you really trust.
Yeah, and especially with, the whole idea of this whole isolation style of thinking now with social media. Like, we're already alone, we feel. So, like, if you take it in drugs in front of people, it could be bad. Ethan, goddamn, that was fucking
Andy,
wonderful.
last thing I'll just say, man, is I also sometimes think, though, I'm wary about psychedelics in a group setting, unless it's a really controlled one, like with a leader or a shaman or something like that, because I find, and it's also true for people who have experienced paranoia with marijuana. My feeling is, what's called the set and setting is important. So if you're going to do this stuff, be with something you don't have to be on with. You don't want to be socializing with people you don't really know, maybe you don't trust or like. You want to be with somebody you really feel relaxed and comfortable with, whether we're talking about psychedelics or weed. I think that makes a real difference.
Do you think guys like Michael Pollan is helping this whole movement or not?
Michael Pollan has been an amazing plus because, it's very hard to cross over and educating the public. But Michael, I've known Michael a little bit since, for 25 years. And Michael, because he already had such a huge following and such respect because of his writing about food.
Yeah.
And he'd been writing about drugs off and on over the last 25 years, too. He wrote a book called Botany of Desire. He did other stuff. But when he did that book, How to Change Your Mind, and he's now got a more recent one where he looks at mescaline and also at caffeine, interestingly.
Oh, wow.
I think he crossed over. I think millions of people started reading and thinking about psychedelics who never otherwise would have because Michael Pollan wrote about it. I mean, I only wish there were more Michael Pollans in the world writing as thoughtfully and as intelligently about him. About this issue as he does.
What's your take on Paul Stamets?
I had both of them on my podcast. Paul, I've known Paul for about 20 years. I mean, Paul Stamets is the guru of mushrooms. I mean, that guy lives and breathes and knows everything about it. He's self-taught.
I
never
love
got
him.
a PhD or anything like that. I take some of his products, not psychedelic ones, but the mushrooms for health thing. And, there's a little bit of evidence maybe it helps with this and that. But Paul is absolutely, I once heard him give 3 lectures. It was actually at the Telluride, Colorado Mushroom Conference.
Let's go.
Right? It was a Telluride, Colorado, every year for like 30 years now. I've spoken there a few times, host a conference, and it brings all the famous mycologists there, the mushroom experts, but it always brings people who are expert about psychedelics and all, alternatives. And Paul gave one speech about mushrooms and the environment, one about mushrooms and medicine, and one about mushrooms and the mind. And each one was more brilliant and compelling than the other one. So, there's a recent documentary out about him, I think on Netflix. I encourage people to watch it, listen to my interviews with him and, Michael Pollan and Andy Weil and, a whole bunch of other famous psychedelic characters on my podcast. So, I mean, these guys are adding an immense amount, I believe, not just to scientific knowledge, but also to helping people live a better life through the responsible use of psychoactive substances.
Ethan, this has been fucking amazing. I'm clapping for you, buddy. I'm so
thank you. Hey, I've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed being on with you guys. Happy to come back anytime.
Yeah, we're definitely.
Appreciate what you're doing.
You're our drug advisor now. We're gonna come. Whenever I have trouble, because I got in trouble. I love mushrooms and I throw them in the crowd sometimes, and my manager's always worried that I'm going to get arrested and get thrown in jail for something. I think mushrooms are so beautiful and powerful, but talking to you, and it's kind of scared me a little bit. I'm not going to be doing that anymore. So I appreciate you.
Well, I got to tell you, basically, it looks microdosing with almost anything appears to be safe. We don't have long studies, but even the higher doses, you're doing the right place. Yeah, I'm almost amazed. I tell you, I look at some friends of mine, go to the marijuana delivery services.
Right
now, all those marijuana delivery services, they got mushroom chocolate bars. Yeah. They got this type of mushroom, that type of mushroom. They even sometimes have different types of 2CB or MDMA, things like that. I mean, I'm amazed at the diversity of stuff that's now available if you know the right phone number to call.
Yeah, Denver is amazing. Like now they're marketing like nice, like they're packaging mushrooms like
really?
They're like a chocolate bar. Yeah, it's pretty wild.
Yeah, well, listen, you should be proud to be living in a state that really led the way with Washington State and the legalization of marijuana. True. So, yeah.
My final question to you is, in a perfect world, what do you think America should do with the drug reform?
Well, I mean, basically, we have to finish off legalizing marijuana in a responsible way. I mean, I'm a believer that we have a moral obligation to try to keep this, not let the big multinationals take over the whole thing. And one of the reasons I'm a little ambivalent about total federal legalization is that opens the door for big alcohol, big tobacco, big pharma, big consumer good companies to come into it. So I don't know how we stop that, because I think it's almost inevitable that it's probably going to happen. But I think we got to find responsible ways to do it. And we got to, it's not just bullshit to try to give a leg up to people, whether it's black people or, white growers, out in the rural areas, to give them a leg up to try to keep playing a role in this industry. I think, secondly, we got to, with the psychedelic stuff, let's keep it moving forward, because that stuff is going to revolutionize, as I said, psychiatry. I think there's a key thing, which is that when it comes to any drug, including heroin, fentanyl, you name it, nobody should be going to jail simply for possessing a small amount of any drug for their own use. That was the Portugal model that started 20 years ago. It's the ballot initiative that passed in Oregon a couple of years ago that my organization, Drug Policy Alliance, did shortly after I stepped down. That principle, that nobody deserves what we put in our body, absent harm to others, and that nobody should go to jail simply for simple drug possession, whether they got a problem or not. If you commit a crime against somebody else, if you rob, you steal, you rape, you hurt, you deserve to be punished, whether you had any addiction or not. Your addiction cannot be your excuse. But simply putting people in jail for simple possession, we got to stop doing that. Lastly, we got to figure out ways in this fentanyl crisis where the people who are committed to using drugs that are really risky, where they can get it from a legal source, and not go to the black market, and figure out a way to do that so that it doesn't present a risk to the greater, broader population. But we need to move closer and closer to the responsible legal regulation of all drugs in such a way that does not create a bigger drug problem. And I don't think we've gotten even close to how far we need to go on that. We still need to keep squeezing the criminalization out, adding in the health dimension, adding in the harm dimension, thinking about that safety net. The vast majority of people who use drugs, they don't need anybody's help. They don't need the government. They don't need their employer telling them what to do. They don't need to be drug tested. And for the minority of people who have a problem with drug problem, hold them responsible if they're hurting other people. But don't fuck with them if all they're doing is using these drugs because they want it or they need it. Yeah.
Let's fucking go. Our guy on the street.
Okay, man.
Thank you, Ethan.
Hey,
thank you, bro.
It's been a blast, guys. Okay, look forward next time. Take care, okay?
Listen to Ethan's podcast, Psychoactive. It's amazing. We're big fans, and we're big fans of you, Ethan. We're going to hit you up next time. Every time we have questions, we're going to hit you up, Ethan. Have a good one.
You got it. I'm available. Take care, Andy. Take care.
Later, bud. Bye-bye. Later. Bye.
Bye-bye.
What a show.
Rules. He knows everything.
What a fucking show. I feel way smarter. Wow. Speaking of people who are staying out of trouble, we have Pete Shapiro, Relics. We got the Godfather of the scene is out here now. What's up, Pete? How you doing?
Hey, Andy. Good to see you, brother. You look good.
You look good too. How's the book selling?
Yeah. It actually is doing better than expected.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it wasn't my idea to do the book, but Dean Budnick, who you mentioned, Relics, the editor of Relics, was like a couple of years ago. You ever write anything down? I had a little health scare. I'm fine, but he's like, you ever? And I had written nothing down. He's like, I'll write it. You can just talk. We'll get a book deal, and he got one. And then we made it the story of 50 concerts. It's not really my story. It's 50 shows. By the way, now I was hesitant at first, a little young, to write it all down, but I'm glad I don't know how people remember it. I could barely remember it now. The story. How do you remember when you're at the end of the life, stuff in your 20s, 30s? I just turned 50. That's one reason we did the 50 stories. And then COVID happened. So I had a lot of nights to just talk. And Dean wrote it down. And so now we got like 300 and something pages. And it's been really cool. People, it's just stories of things I've been through, the good, the bad, whatever, and every day I call him, the last couple of years, call Dean. It's a great way to do it. And just throw out a thought or an idea, and then we put it all together.
Do you still like it?
Yeah, I love the shows.
Yeah.
I saw ZZ
what don't
Top
you like?
No, I love the shows. Oh, I don't. I like the shows. We'll stick to that. I don't like the daytime, like dealing with HR stuff.
Yeah.
All these venues. We got a Brooklyn Bowl now, and Nashville, Vegas, obviously in New York, Philly, where you're going to play the anniversary thing. We were excited, the Capitol. But then you do ZZ Top last night. And you get to spend time with Billy Gibbons on his bus after.
So cool.
That's easy. It makes it worth it. But what I mean hard is like we got a 3 nights with Phil Letcher doing 9 shows with Phil. That's great, obviously. Yeah. But that comes with incoming. The text thing is a big thing. Anyone who wants to go in to be a live music promoter. In the 70s, I was telling Ron Delsner the other day, when he was putting on shows in 1969, 1979, 1989, 99, 2009, people would come. They wanted to get VIP, meet them, free tickets. They'd call the office. They'd leave a message. Now it's, yo, Shappy, what's up? Bill's coming, yo, come by Sunday, Saturday, can I get VIP, And email, at least you can kind of ignore. Oh, I missed the email.
Yeah.
Sorry, bro.
Yeah. Text message you can't ignore.
Text message you cannot ignore.
What was the hardest show? What was the hardest show that you promoted that was the most fulfilling?
Well, that's the 50th anniversary Dead show. Fairly well. That was hard. And then everything we did was under such a microscope of social media. And actually, it wouldn't be the same today. Just there's so much other stuff swirling more in 2022 than there was in 2015. Really? 7 years later. Yeah. Just Trump wasn't, that stuff wasn't as formulated or developed. But streaming, maybe there was Netflix then, but it wasn't like there's like 200 big shows, TV shows, and there's podcasts like what we're doing. In 15, it was starting when I opened like Brooklyn Bowl in 2009, like The Sopranos, there was like 10 TV shows. Sopranos.
So crazy.
There was no podcast, by the way, none. You still have movies, there's books, but like there's just so much more, all the listening platforms, audio, Spotify, that kind of stuff. When I opened Brooklyn Bowl in 2009, like didn't exist. And I think it was easier for me to create what Brooklyn Bowl became because it was easier to get oxygen and promote and have our lane. Right. I actually think it'd be harder now. Luckily, these new ones that we're doing now, it's kind of already established.
Yeah.
But there's so much flying around. TikTok.
Do you think oversaturation is diluting the scene?
Well, when you say the scene, you mean our
just like entertainment.
Oh, right. Yeah. There's so much flying around. TikTok.
Yeah, like how do you pay attention?
Snap. It's hard, by the way. Yeah, it's harder. So it's easier for us, thank God. We got out ahead a little bit. And now we already have the 150,000 person email list.
Right.
I talk to the kids, the people who I work with and work for me at these venues. You got to get the email list to a certain point, to 100,000. That takes a couple of years, by the way, of doing shows to really be able to press send and sell tickets on the on sale without having, when you launch a venue that's new, and I've done it a bunch, it's hard. You start at no email list,
right?
0. And you got to bang it out, and you can't build it without doing the shows. But when you're doing a show with no email list, you're not going to sell the tickets.
Yeah. Like how hard was it the Brooklyn Bowl in Philadelphia to get the email list. It's like Philadelphia is such a niche market, like, and you're bringing Brooklyn Bowl to Philadelphia, which is already a fucking,
we're like, come on.
Exactly.
Let's just say we have a new logo that's like that Brooklyn Bowl genie thing with a fish in there for fish town. We're trying to be a little more Philly. Not easy to do. We're not there yet. Yeah, but the email list is, I think, like 67. We're not at that 100. Let me tell you what's selling tickets in Philly, though. Andy Frasco. November 1. Wow, you like how I brought that home. It's true. You did. I checked the count because I'm coming down for it. I'm flying in. My guy I work with is getting married. And I'm like, yo, I'm going to Angelhow, but I'm like, I got to get back. I can't stay. I'm going for the opening night on the 3rd. Shapiro, I'm flying back on the 4th, hitting Philly to be there with you. I'm going to be there. November. I'm going to be there. And I checked your tickets. We're good. We're going to be ready. It's going to be a right rager. So, by the way, that's a testament. Sorry.
And I heard that. I appreciate you giving us the 1-year anniversary. Philly. I love Philly, and I just like going back to it. Like, Philly is such a proud city of being Philadelphia. It must have been a fucking milestone to even get to 70,000 email lists. It's like it just takes a while to grow into that city, and because you're bringing in such great talent, and what Philadelphia needs is. I just, it's like the
it's
fans.
Not easy to go. Yeah, but Brooklyn. But the idea is, it's like Brooklyn's fun. It's Coney Island. It's not meant to be that Brooklyn. It's supposed to be like, the fun house Brooklyn. So we thought about it. Problem is, like, in Vegas, it's Brooklyn Bowl. In Nashville, it's Brooklyn Bowl. We actually, that was a huge conversation. It's like, are we going to be doing like Philly Bowl and Vegas Bowl and Nashville, or are we doing Brooklyn Bowl? And once we started with Brooklyn Bowl, we were kind of like, okay, we're that. And then we got to Philly, and we're like, oh shit, would have been easier if we were Philly Bowl. Just to tell everyone how it really is. But guess what? We're already Brooklyn. We're Brooklyn. So we think about ways that we can be Philly. You know what I mean? And then, you try to be good at what you do. You have the staff be cool. They're obviously all from Philly. And you just try to put on good shows. And it takes time. And you got to bang it every day. That's back to, like, it's hard.
Right.
You can be doing now in Brooklyn Bowl, New York, at Capital. Some of these things get a little easier. But then you go open in Philly and call it Brooklyn, and you make it hard again. And but we're doing it, and I'm super psyched. We are celebrating our first anniversary. We opened it with Soul Live with George Porter and Questlove DJ. He wasn't, but we were going to have him after you. By the way, we got Gut Willie. I don't know if that's been announced. He's going to DJ, I think, a thing.
Who? Barber. Yeah, Barber. Yeah, it's gonna be awesome.
He's gonna come by. And you sold a lot of but we thought about it. Like, we thought Frasco and what you do and what you represent and the way you embrace fun in the show, we were like, that's a perfect show. And I'll just tell you, I mean, we haven't talked offline, what I'm saying, but like, it's sold. It's going to be a great scene. And that's what we try to do in these venues, is create a place that is the home of it for what we do. Our music, our band. We've had all our bands, the Umphreys guys, and the J-Rag guys, and the Pigeons guys, and the Twiddle guys, all that. The Biscuit, Barber, and Brownie. We've done all that there. Plus more. We're doing Go-Go Bordello coming up. St. Paul and the Broken Bones coming up. I mean, just all that kind of stuff that we've done in other places. And a lot of it's about the staff and how you treat people, and obviously the vibe in the room, and the disco balls and the Christmas lights. That's why we're friends.
You bring the vibe.
Disco balls and Christmas lights.
Yeah. I got one more question. I know you got to get out of here, but I got one more question for you, Pete. Being a promoter after COVID and seeing ticket sales all around the country, what's your take on the music industry in the next couple years?
Oh, you're getting good at this podcast. I mean, these questions. That was good. You're like a real journalist. This ain't no Frasco. Just fucking.
Yeah. No, hire me, Pete.
No, you need lie. I actually think it's going to be strong. It is strong because people, you can, it could go away any minute, right? It did go away. So I think there's people, obviously the Alpha Live people were like itching to go back the minute you could. But I hope that the outer banks a little bit, the outer edges of people who maybe before could stay home. By the way, I go to the streaming stuff because you could just stay home and watch Netflix.
Yeah.
Or Hulu and watch, pick
or
up,
fans.
You can watch it live on a stream on fans. So you don't have to go as much, but ain't not like alive being there.
I know.
And you know what? You ready? I gotta say, it's in the book. You ready?
Yeah.
You can't see it if you're not there. You know, you can't be there if you're not there. Really,
Right.
Like to be that feeling of a live show. It's great. And look, I do the streaming stuff. We've done stuff together, and it's great.
Yeah.
But capital B.
Right.
It's still, you still want to be there, and you can't be there if you're not there. I get up and go to shows like you. I'll do the red eye here, like, and you can't. You just can't be there if you're not there. And so that's why I'm bullish. I think people, the feeling of live, like we talked earlier, like it never fades.
Yeah.
People have seen a lot of shows. You've seen a ton of shows, done a lot of shows. I've seen, I've done a show every night, almost 27 years, and I'm still like, I'm psyched to go see Jane's Addiction and the Pumpkins tonight.
You've been kind of a celebrity at the Garden. You've been always hanging out with Jimmy Fallon, eating hot dogs and shit. I've been watching you on ESPN all the time, dude. It's wild.
I went to Harry Styles with him, and I put a bow on. I didn't know we'd be. I got to pay attention more. Like, so I'm wearing this blue bow. I'd do it again, and I didn't think that people would be taking pictures, but my kids the next morning are on TikTok, and they're like, "Dad, all my friends are sending me pictures. You're in a boa. I look pretty. I can't pull it off as well as you could, Brett, but
it's pretty
you
good.
Got to be careful next time. You just, it's all good.
Oh, it's funny. Well, how did you get? What's your relationship like with Jimmy Fallon? You guys seem like you're really close.
Yeah, I met him at Wetlands. 20 years ago at a Zen Trickster show.
Yeah, in
the basement. It always anyone you met in the basement of Wetlands at a Zen Trickster show. That's gonna be a lifelong friend. That's a good answer. Just for you. Yeah, I met this dude in the basement of Wetlands at a Zen Trickster show. Yeah, that's the end of our interview. Period. Stop. That's how I met. And so we're great friends, and because it all started there, brother.
I love it. You've built so many memories for so many people, and I know I'm not the only one who wants to say this, but I just want to say thank you for all the memories you've given all of us. I mean, you've helped us out with all our careers so much that maybe you don't get to see all the love that you deserve, and I hope you do, because you really are, Pied Piper of this stuff. So thank you, buddy.
I love it. Thanks, brother. I'm excited. I'm going to see you in Philly, and I hope
I'll see you in a couple weeks.
I hope everyone there mostly remembers those memories.
They will, buddy. I got one last question.
And if you forget a few of them, that's good too.
Yeah, that's why you have a book.
Right.
Wow.
That
Pete,
was funny. That was good. Love you, buddy.
I fucking love it. I love you too. Thanks for being a ray of sunshine. I needed you today. I appreciate it. We'll see you in a couple weeks.
I'll see you in a few weeks, buddy.
Yeah, be safe, buddy. Have a good one.
Love you. I'll see you in Philly.
Later. Fucking Pete Shapiro. Let's go.